college, I took a part-time job as a driver for the local public school district. The job involved delivering equipment back and forth between campuses in the school district. The hours were flexible, and as long as deliveries were made in a reasonable time, I could deliver day or evening. This was really the perfect schedule for me because it paid pretty well and I could work around my class schedule. In job searching, I saw this listing pop up and then disappear, only to pop up again. They must not be able to keep people in the job because of the weird work hours, I thought to myself. I generally drove a flatbed truck, and most of what I moved was small stuff. Desks, shelving, that sort of stuff, and sometimes the truck was full with larger equipment. Being open, we'd use a tarp to protect things from the weather. I generally drove alone. There wasn't enough in the budget for 2 delivery drivers. Aside from the good pay, I really liked the alone time. Being at school and having roommates made it hard to get away from it all sometimes, so the solo drives were great. The commutes were long enough to catch a podcast or 2 uninterrupted. There was one route that was the exception. It was a long stretch of road at the edge of a national forest. Since I was still new, I'd only driven it once before. Not only were there tons of deer that would pop out into the road, it was pretty isolated and there was no cell service for most of it, which of course made me uncomfortable, especially as a young woman. I'm not tiny, I work out, and I'm pretty strong, and I've never lived in great neighborhoods, so I've learned to be aware of my surroundings, but still. Maybe it was my imagination, but this stretch of road always creeped me out. That year, there was also a string of missing persons in the area. Everyone on campus was uneasy about it, and the college gave us warnings and safety police bulletins. One evening, I had 2 deliveries to make. The first was the closest, but took me straight through evening rush hour traffic. I had to make it there by 6, as the school office would close at 6, and I had to drop off a desk, which was not something you could leave outside. The second delivery looked like a pallet of office supplies. I think the bulk of it was printer paper, but it was all wrapped up in a tarp when it was lifted onto my truck. This was my second stop, and you guessed it. It was to the farthest school, straight through that isolated stretch of road. It was nagging me that I'd be driving that road in the dark, but there wasn't much I could do about it. City traffic was going to take as long as it was going to take. Also, the dispatcher had told me to make that my last stop. His office was located at that school, and he said he'd help me unload. It was 5:36, and the sun was setting. I double-checked the wrapped equipment and made sure everything was secure. I started my drive and lost myself in my podcast as I sat in rush hour traffic, staring at taillights and inching along a few feet at a time. My podcast was really getting interesting, and I was in that mode where you start laughing along with the narrator. I had a big smile on my face as I pulled up to a light and looked around. On the corner, I saw a tree with 5 or 6 missing persons signs. Each one of them had a picture of a young man or woman. The signs looked pretty fresh, and it gave me a shiver, and I turned away. I hope they find those people, I thought to myself. Traffic started moving, and finally breaking up as we headed out of the city. I took my exit and settled into the long drive. I would be on this road for at least another 45 minutes. About 20 minutes into the drive, I started hearing sounds from my open driver's side window. I looked in my side view mirror to see that the tarp had started coming undone and was flapping in the wind. Oh man, I thought, I really didn't want to deal with this. I was getting so close to my stop. But I had to fix the tarp or the load might get ruined. I pulled onto the shoulder against the woods. It was mostly dark now, so I reached around on the floor to find a flashlight. I couldn't shake the thought that I was all alone out here without cell service. I just wanted to get there and be done with it. I couldn't find the flashlight, so I grabbed my phone and used the phone's flashlight. I opened the door and hopped out. The road was dark, and all I could hear was the hum of the truck's engine and that stupid tarp flapping in the breeze. I walked to the back of the flatbed and climbed up. As I secured the loose tarp, I fumbled around looking for the bungee cords that held it down. I found the cord, picked it up, and saw, when I went to wrap it around the tarp, that it had been cut. I stood for a moment looking at that cut cord under the bright light of my phone's flashlight. What the hell? I thought. It was then that I realized that somewhere between my pickup and now, someone or something had cut that bungee cord. It wasn't cut when I checked it at pickup. I could feel my heart beating faster, and I looked around trying to adjust my eyes to the darkness. I raised my phone to use the flashlight, but the light didn't go very far. I turned and pressed my back against the pallet, scanning the wood line and the truck, but I couldn't see anything. As I turned back to secure the bungee around the tarp, I heard something moving in the brush. My heart sank, and I turned quickly to point my flashlight in that direction. Not enough light. Whatever it was just beyond the light. I stood very still with my phone pointed towards the place I had heard the movement, but now there was no sound. The movement had stopped. All I could hear was my truck. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon or something natural, but I couldn't stop the feeling of dread from rushing over me. I was a sitting duck standing on the back of this truck on this dark road in the middle of nowhere with no cell service. The only lights I had were my headlights facing in the opposite direction, my red taillights, and this dinky little phone flashlight. I could feel the panic rising. Stop, I thought to myself. Just keep it together. Screw the bungee cord, I thought. I crouched down to jump off the truck and heard movement again. I looked up and saw the shape of a person moving from behind a tree. I froze, staring, trying to understand what my eyes were seeing. The dark shape was facing me, and as I stood frozen, it started moving towards me. The next thing I heard was my body landing on the road, each foot slamming one in front of the other as I rounded the side of the truck towards the driver's side door. More sounds behind me, now closer, like something running through the brush. I jumped into the truck, scanning the mirrors as I did, and rolled up my windows. All I could see was the dark road now red from the taillights. I couldn't see anyone or anything behind me. I threw the truck in gear and slammed on the gas. I don't remember actually looking forward for a few miles because I was so busy staring at my rear view and side mirrors. The only sounds I could hear were the truck's engine and that damn tarp slamming against the side of the truck. About 10 minutes later, I took the exit off this road and turned into the suburban area where the destination school was located. There were streetlights on, and parked cars, and houses with people in them. I started feeling my heart slow down. My hands were still shaking when I reached the gate to the school. I punched in my code, and the gate opened. I pulled in and stepped out to unload. My legs were shaky, but I was starting to feel safer. The dispatcher should be here any minute, and I had to tell him everything. I rounded the back of the truck, and in the dim parking lot light saw the shiny glint of a huge knife on the floor of the flatbed. My stomach lurched. This must have been used to cut the bungee, I thought. As I stood frozen, staring at that knife, I heard footsteps approaching the truck. I heard the familiar jingling of the dispatcher's keys. Oh, good, I thought. He'd know what to do. He's been working here forever. Before reaching the back of the truck, I heard him say, "How is hunting tonight? Did you get us another one?" If you enjoyed that story, I'm glad you found me. I tell creepy stories about scary encounters and paranormal events. If this is your thing too, stay, listen, and subscribe to Lady Grimm for more stories. It's okay to keep the lights on. Let me tell you another story. When I was a kid, like 11 years old or so, I was at my friend's house playing and lost track of time. I was supposed to be home before dark, but ended up getting home about an hour after the sun had set. In my defense, it was early spring, and the sun was still setting pretty early. My parents were going out after work, but wanted me back before dark. My grandmother, my dad's mom, was visiting from Ireland, and I figured they just wanted me to spend more time with her. She didn't get upset with me for being late, but just told me to sit down because dinner was ready. She had a serious look on her face, though, so I thought I was about to get an earful for being late. We started eating our food, and she looked me square in the eye and said, "Has your father ever told you about the Bog Witch?" Now that's a name I would have remembered, so I looked at her and said, "No, he's never mentioned that. What's the Bog Witch?" At first, my grandmother's nose scrunched up, and she took a deep breath. Most people think the Bog Witch is a legend told by mothers and fathers as a way to keep young people home when the sun went down. But she is real. I've seen her. And so has your father. I looked carefully at my grandmother and stopped eating. She told me the Bog Witch was a spirit that thrives in darkness, something that comes up from cold, dank places to feed on the living. She's called the Bog Witch because nobody knows what her real name is or even what she is. She leaned in and asked, "Have you seen the movie The Ring?" I had, and it freaked me out, and I told her, "Yes, I've seen it." Well, that spirit is in every culture. If you look hard enough, you'll find a Bog Witch in every corner of the world. She went on to explain that this spirit was often called a shadow person, or a witch, or a demon, anything that really couldn't be explained but was dark and relentless. Most often, people will see the spirit when they're alone because it's easier for her to take the living when they're at their weakest. Well, now I was very freaked out and had so many questions. "You said Dad saw her?" "Yes, when he was a young man living with me in Dublin, just before he met your mother. He was studying late and saw her just after clearing through Phoenix Park. He told me that he had felt something watching him as he left the park and started crossing the street. When he turned back to look, he saw the figure of what looked like a woman on her hands and knees, her head arched up, hair falling around her face. She had stayed in the shadows, but was gone when he turned back to see if she was following. He told me he'd never sprinted so fast in his life. The problem is, once you've seen her and escaped, she won't leave you alone. I've asked him if he's seen her since, and he's told me no. But that doesn't mean she's gone, or that she won't bother anyone your dad loves. And that includes you. It, can appear any time, so you must be careful." I sat listening to her, utterly terrified. My hands were sweating and clenched. With that, she broke the spell by pushing her chair back, picking up the plates, and taking them into the kitchen. She came back in and said, "Now, he won't be happy that I told you about the spirit, so don't tell him I told you. He didn't believe me then, and just said he must have been seeing things. But I know she's real. Always be sure to be indoors before dark when you're alone." With that, she told me to go shower and get ready for bed, that my parents would be home soon. I remember how creeped out I felt, and I turned all the lights on as I went upstairs and didn't dare turn them off for sleep. I think I slept with the lights on for a month. My parents had no idea why I wouldn't turn them out. Fast forward to when I am 16. I had long dismissed the legend of the Bog Witch as a story my cheeky grandmother had told me so I'd come home before dark. I didn't even know if my dad had really seen her, and I wasn't going to ask him. Honestly, I thought if I did ask him, he'd probably say, "Ha! Grandma got you with one of her stories, didn't she?" Every year that passed, my parents gave me more and more freedom, and by age 16, I was able to stay alone in the house when they'd go on short trips overnight. Of course, they always told me, lock the doors, keep the lights on, and don't go out after dark. Of course, even though I didn't believe it at the time, the legend of the bog witch tickled the back of my brain with my parents' warnings. These are just all the usual things parents tell kids, I told myself. They told me I could have one friend come over one Friday night when they would be gone overnight. My friend drove over after they left to play some video games and to hang out. She was going to spend the night, which was nice because we could stay up as late as we wanted, since we didn't have school the next day. We ordered pizza and ate on the back deck, then played video games for hours. Just after 1, my friend said she was feeling kind of nauseous and decided she wanted to go home. I walked her down the driveway to her car and said goodbye. I turned around and walked towards the house. The neighborhood was so quiet. You could only hear the hum of traffic in the distance, people driving on the distant highway in the early morning hours. But my street was silent. My car was parked on the side of the house in the driveway, and I remembered I'd left my glasses in the car's console. I went over to my car, opened the door, and reached into the console. The car's overhead light was so bright in comparison to the night's darkness. As I backed out of the car door, I dropped my glasses and they rolled forward away from the car. I walked around the door and bent to reach my glasses case. As I stepped back towards the door, I caught movement at the tree line. About 20 feet away, I saw something crouching on the ground. My breath caught in my throat and I squinted, trying really hard to understand what I was seeing. In that moment, I knew that I was staring directly at the bog witch. The memory of my grandmother's description crashed into my head. I was looking at what looked like a woman crouched down on all fours, facing directly at me with her head cocked straight up, staring at me. I could just make out a big, menacing smile below piercing eyes. The only word that popped into my brain was, "Run!" I had to get away from this thing. I bolted towards the back of the house, hoping I'd left the back door unlocked after dinner. With every step I took, I knew that it was following me. I could hear what sounded like an animal running behind me. Not on 2 feet, but on 4. I didn't dare look back. It would just slow me down. I took the stairs in a few bounds and landed on the deck. The lights in the house were on, and I hoped that the legend was true, that this thing, whatever it was, hated light. I reached the glass door and slid inside, closing and locking the door. I turned on the deck light and saw nothing. There was nothing out there. Just the deck chairs and our empty pizza box. I scanned the yard. Nothing. My heart was in my throat. What do I do now? Do I call the police? Do I call my parents? I decided to call my parents. I always have my phone on me and was never so thankful for my phone addiction. No answer. I tried again. Neither one of them answered. I found myself pacing through the living room and started turning on all the lights I could reach. Then it hit me. The front door was unlocked, and maybe even wide open. I couldn't remember if I'd closed it when I walked out of the house. I tried listening for any sounds coming from the front room. It was quiet. I dreaded what I had to do next. I slowly walked towards the front room, which was dark. And there, just through the dark entryway, was the wide open front door. I was breathing so hard I couldn't even think. I had to close the door, but what if this thing was already inside? There was no light switch on my side of the entryway, just one by the door. I took a deep breath and crossed to the door. I closed and locked it, leaning against the back of the door. All I could hear was my heartbeat. I looked down at my phone and dialed again, voicemail. I clicked end and reached for the light switch. Just as I reached towards the dark, I saw movement on the floor in the open coat closet by the door. I have never run so fast in my life. I bolted towards the back of the house, towards the stairs. As I took the first few steps, I heard a crash as my phone fell out of my hand and onto the stairs. I looked back to see it tumble down the steps towards the floor. As I was looking, the thing rounded the corner on all fours and started climbing up the stairs towards me. I reached the top of the stairs and looked down in horror. It was following me. I ran to my bedroom and slammed the door. I must have passed out because I woke up to my parents looking down at me, completely panicked. I popped straight up and looked around. They called and called, but I had never answered, so they came home. "What happened?" my mom asked. I looked at my dad and said, "The bog witch is real. Everything Grandma said was real. It's not a legend. It was here. I saw it, and it was here in the house." My dad's eyes got huge, and he hugged me. And as he did, I said, "But Grandma was wrong about one thing. She's not afraid of the light."